If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. So today's episode is one I've been wanting to do for a little while, and I guess it's not super timely because the video I'm going to be responding to is a little old, but the content itself is very relevant. I guess it's evergreen, but becoming maybe ever greener because it pertains to not only what Christians should be thinking about in terms of politics, but it touches on things of Christian nationalism, separation of church and state, and those are things that, of course, are becoming more prevalent as Christian nationalism and those in the Christian nationalist community continue to make content, put arguments out there, engage in the national dialogue, and occasionally make headlines. And we as Christian libertarians, we here at LCI, although it would be probably presumptuous and overcorrection and incorrect to say that we don't have any overlap with anyone who uses the title Christian nationalism. I don't believe that's true. I've interviewed Christian nationalists, talked to them on my show. I've talked to Stephen Wolf, Andrew Wilson, people like CJ Engel who don't use the title but have overlap with Christian nationalism. There are things that we can find that we agree on, and I even like some people who call themselves Christian nationalists. But it is something that I do also feel compelled to point out where I think that they get things wrong and to engage in this dialogue from the other side, so to speak, or from a third side, because I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of times, when you see Christian nationalists engaging with critics, they're engaging with critics who I don't think really offer great arguments on the other side. A lot of times I'm seeing Stephen Wolf engage with sort of like just neoliberal or neoconservative Christians who are disagreeing with the Christian nationalist position or disagreeing with theonomists, but they're doing so from their own place of being incorrect on the Christian position of politics, on sort of like American foreign policy, on history, on eschatology, on a number of things. So the video I'm going to be responding to today is not someone who is a quote unquote Christian nationalist, maybe in a explicit sense, but who from time to time says that he agrees with certain claims of Christian nationalists. And that is the YouTuber Redeemed Zoomer. Overall, I enjoy Redeemed Zoomer's content. I've actually even reached out to invite him on the show to have a conversation with him because he gets some things right, but I think he gets some things wrong pertaining to politics. He has been critical of libertarianism, and I don't think he understands what libertarianism is. And so I'd like to have a conversation and be able to ask him some questions and present some ideas to him, get him to follow up and see where we agree and disagree. Those kind of conversations can be good and edifying, even if you are, trying to hash out certain disagreements. And I've seen him do so. We've both been on like the Crucible YouTube channel and participated in debates, although his debate was more theological and mine was more political. But so it's a short video. I'm not sure I'll play the whole thing. I have thoughts I want to speak to, and I'll just kind of play it and then pause as I feel led to. So I'm going to bring it up now.
The early Presbyterians believed in separation of church and state, but they also believed that the state should be Christian.
All right. So his initial claim here is that there's a separation of church and state, but that the state should be Christian. Now, I'll let him explain more of what his position is, but just initial thoughts on that. It depends on what you mean by the state should be Christian, and how do we even define what the state is? And I would say that part of the libertarian view, but I think this is not, so again, I never want to confuse anyone, and certainly while I am a libertarian in a political sense, I am a Christian, and I think that Christians should derive principles of what is the biblical view or Christian view of politics from the Bible and not from secular philosophies. In fact, I'm going to be going back over this here soon. And you can go back. It did a good enough job. Episode 1, What is Biblical Anarchy, sort of makes the case for how I avoid biblical eisegesis and why I don't think my arguments are eisegesis. But I'm going to be redoing that episode, sort of doing a remastered version of my pilot episode here soon. But I'm not done with it yet, and I wanted to do this episode because it's been on my mind for a while. And so I with that caveat out of the way, certainly I think when we look at what the Bible says about government and governance and the examples of nations and governance, we immediately, I think even just from reading the Bible, have to understand there's a difference between the state and civil governance, right? Civil governance is a biblical institution. Now, I believe that civil governance is something that is a consequence of the fall. I don't agree with someone like Stephen Wolfe, for example, who would define civil governance as something that was inherent to human society, including pre-fall society. And he goes into that in his book. I think the error he makes is that he is sort of defining civil governance not as that which pertains to law, which is more about that's closer to what I would define civil governance as, what I think the Bible does. But he thinks that civil governance includes, this might be an oversimplification, but broadly speaking, that it includes anything we do together as a society, right? People cooperating together in their communities, in nations, in civil society, and that all of this different interaction and organization and collective human action could be described as essentially governance. Now, language is a little bit fluid, I guess, and so words can have multiple meanings or uses. And so, yeah, in a sense, the word governance can have a very broad meaning, like church can have governance, right? A corporation can have governing bodies, even like political parties and stuff have their own governing bylaws. Nonprofits have so like you have the rules, and then you have the enforcement of the rules, the carrying out of the rules, or of some kind of organization. Then you could maybe in a generic sense call that governance, right? But the problem is there'll be kind of a bait and switch, in my opinion, where we talk about that and then we sort of like, okay, but then when we're talking about what the Bible is referring to as governance, it seems like it's always in conjunction with the initiate or the use of coercion, right? Bearing the sword, as Romans 13 talks about, or the principle of just retribution as brought up in, and I forget the chapter, forgive me, but after the flood and the Noahic covenant, where it says, for if a man's blood is shed, then by a man shall his blood be shed. So we have the principle of just retribution, lex talionis. And so these are two clear examples in the Bible of the idea of governance, and that being tied to the wielding of the sword, right? The bearing of the sword, the enforcement of civil justice. And so right away, and I haven't even gotten to like a lot of his video yet, just the first, 15 seconds. But right away, it's like, well, what do you mean by the state and what is governance? And then what do you even mean by these things should be Christian, right? So like the state isn't a thing. The state is a group, right? Or an entity that consists of individuals, and those individuals do things. You know, certainly the Bible teaches about governance and that there will be those who uphold civil justice. And we believe that that is, like, we at LCI believe this, and then I'm more reformed. And so I would plug the Reformed Libertarians podcast, Greg Bowles, Kerry Baldwin. And if I wanted to, I could bring up the Reformed Libertarian statement and cite exactly how they put it. But that, civil governance it's like a godly office, right? It's a biblically defined, biblically taught office. But we have to be able to define what that office is and look at what is prescribed for that office and understand the norms of that. And then we would have to compare that to sort of like what is available, what has been experimented, what's being proposed in terms of ways of conducting, ways of executing said office and governance, and see if those measure up to the prescription gave for the office, as well as not falling into any contradictions or committing other sins, right? So right away, if we were to compare even two different types of monopoly governances, right? So you could compare monarchy and a democratic republic such as America with a constitution, and you might be able to, on the final analysis, say that the democratic republic is perhaps less at odds with certain issues than a monarchy would be, although there are other libertarians who have perhaps made the argument that there are some trade-offs with monarchy that are more preferable to that of a democratic republic. So there's nuance there, people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, but just for the sake of argument, let's say that a democratic republic is better or preferable on libertarian and Christian grounds than a monarchy. That doesn't even mean that it's the preferred or that it's the ideal, that it doesn't have. So, for example, in a Christian sense, a democratic republic with a constitution can still be in danger of a sort of collectivism that distorts the way God has ordered society. It can lead to a sort of disassociation of morality where that which is usually considered to be immoral or that which would be considered unconsensual in normal circumstances would be called good or consensual just because a vote was cast, right? And there are certain things, and this is with all states, right? Or at least with all, or another word, better word would be all monopoly styles of governance. Well, what forms the monopoly is an initiation of coercion. It's a violation of consent. And so this is why, although I maintain, obviously, I'm ecumenical with non-anarchist Christians and non-anarchist libertarians, I think the only consistent view of governance from a Christian and a biblical worldview is that of non-monopoly governance, which would be, you could call that, a anarcho-capitalist legal order, a polycentric legal order, you could call it voluntarism, a lot of different names for it, right? Private law, another one that comes to mind. So right away, these are things that we have to keep in mind and we have to ask. There is such a thing as like a normalcy bias, where we just assume, because we've been raised in a society where nation states are the norm, that it's like, okay, well, when the Bible talks about government or civil justice or law or anything like that, that's the same as what we have today in these structures, right? But we have to have an understanding of things that's only biblical, but that's also like understanding how government worked in antiquity, how it worked even several hundred years ago, and how it worked now, and understand the differences there. So that's a lot of things that we have to ask to even understand what redeems Zoomer's statement is there. And this is why I want to have a conversation with him, because without having these terms properly defined, it's almost hard to get into the rest of the video. Now, I'm going to get into the rest of the video, and this is partly because I'm just interested to continue engaging with his ideas. He has another video that's specifically about the separation of church and state, which I'd like to do at a later point if I can't get him on, but I would rather get him on and just be able to ask him, not just make criticisms or observations, but ask him follow-up questions and have a dialogue on it. So, all right, let's bring this back up.
So today is an important day because I'm finally finishing the journey back to my original Presbyterian church that I built on this Christian Minecraft server. I built St. Athanasius Presbyterian Church, but it got hijacked by the villagers who worship the pink sheep. So I retreated and I went to the middle of nowhere and tried to start a new church, but it wasn't nearly as good. So now I'm going to take back my original church, just like a lot of Christians are trying to take back America. We're seeing a rise in people talking about Christian nationalism, and then other Christians saying, oh, we shouldn't do that because there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, and Christians shouldn't be political. And then the left-wing media saying, oh, it's all fascist. These Christians are being fascist. So it's an important question. Should Christians be involved in politics? And if so, how much? Does that mean we need a theocracy? Does that mean we're going to go back to the ages of the Puritans? What does that mean exactly? Should Christians be involved in politics? So I made another video in the past about the idea of separation of church and state, because this phrase is completely misunderstood. Presbyterians came up with the idea of separation of church and state, but what they meant by that was not that the state shouldn't be religious. They did not mean the state should never make laws based on religion. They meant that the church and state should be separate institutions and not really interfere with each other, but both of them should be Christian. They should be two separate Christian institutions, two different things that are both in covenant with God. That's why the 1600s Presbyterians were called the Covenanters.
All right, so there's a lot there. Right away, he brought up Christian nationalism, and he said that the idea of the original Presbyterians, the original reformers, was that separation of church and state is that these are different institutions, right? And so they're not just one body. But he still maintained that what they believed was that the government, the state should still be Christian, and it should pass laws based on the Christian faith. Now, again, so this is where everything I brought up before I played more of that is really important, because it's like, well, what do you mean by it should be Christian? So there's a few different possibilities, right? If by it should be Christian, you mean that, well, it would be preferable if the people who are in our government, in our state, are Christian. Okay, that would be one possibility, one possible interpretation, where I'd go, okay, I mean, I'm not sure that is like a 100% rule, right? And even then we have to get, so what do you mean by a Christian? Like, I mean, because Zimmer might agree with me, like, if the entire government was Mormons, they call themselves Christians, not really Christian, or, he's Reformed, I'm Reformed. If it was entirely Catholic, or it was entirely Lutheran, or if it was entirely Eastern Orthodox, I'm just saying, like, we'd have to be a little bit more precise, or at least I want to know, like, what does he mean by that? Because there's different meanings to the understanding of, like, even Christians being in government, making sure that they're actually Christians, and what type of Christianity is it? And they're passing laws based on Christianity. Again, passing laws on which type of Christianity, because that can look very different depending on which Christianity we're talking about. So, yeah, if it's just like, as a general sense, right, just to be charitable, like if the preference or the goal here is just, well, the people in government can be Christian or not Christian, and maybe in general is on balance, like you'd rather them be Christian than not Christian. I wouldn't have much disagreement with that. But I also think that we need to understand what he, like, so without the clarifying question, and also based on everything else he says, because he says pass laws based on Christianity, again, that an important follow-up that would need to be asked is, okay, like, because I could say that I want laws passed based on Christianity, but, and so this was actually I had a debate with Andrew Wilson once, who was an Eastern Orthodox, and he kept on, like, what he tried to do was use the same argumentation I'm kind of bringing up here and be like, well, because you would rather have Christians in government, and because your moral worldview is Christian, you're a Christian nationalist because you want Christian laws enforced on society. And it's like, well, kind of, but we have major disagreements over what the entailment of that is. Now, there's a big disagreement between Eastern Orthodox and Reformed. I don't want to get into that, but like in terms of what Redeemed Zimmer's talking about and him being Reformed, and I'm maybe not, I'm technically a Baptist, so sorry, Zimmer, I'm not really Reformed according to Zimmer and other Presbyterians. I personally like saying I'm lowercase r Reformed, right? Because in the libertarian world, you have capital L and lowercase l libertarians, and so I like to say there's uppercase and lowercase r Reformed. But whatever, I'd also be happy just to say I'm a Calvinistic Baptist or a non-denominational Christian who happens to agree with a lot of Reformed theology, and that's beyond just predestination. I'm very influenced by Kuyperianism, very influenced by covenant theology, very influenced by sphere sovereignty, and a lot of ideas of Reformed theology beyond just what typically people might think of Calvinistic theology is just tulip and that's all there is to it. So he gets into later in this video. I don't want to jump the gun too much because I might want to play more of it. But one possibility within what is considered, just broadly speaking, Reformed and Christian governance within that is, the original reformers believed in what's called establishmentarianism, which was the idea that the civil magistrate should actually pass laws to institute a certain religion, and thus that religious, like certain norms and practices of that religion in society. Now, other Presbyterians then later on in America, as well as other, I think, Scottish Presbyterians. I think the American Presbyterians did not agree with the English or the Scottish Presbyterians, who those are the ones who supported the civil establishment of religion. And so then in the 1700s, you had the first American Presbytery, which that was their adopting act which was the Synod of Philadelphia. And they affirmed Westminster Standards, Confession and Catechisms. And then in 1729, we have an official American rewrite of those standards. 1729 was the Synod of Philadelphia, the adopting act. And then in 1788, they were the rewrite of those standards by the American Presbyterians, and they projected enforcing religious principles by means of civil government. So now Redeemer is from America as well, but I forget his real name. I've heard it before. I think it might be Richard, but I might be wrong, so I'm just going by Zemer. That's what he typically goes by. So anyway, I should play more of what his video is before I get into much more about the confessions, but this whole idea about establishmentarianism and the establishment of civil religion is important to understanding, what do you mean by passing Christian laws? If you mean that we should have Sabbath laws, if we should have blasphemy laws, if we should make sure that the Bible is taught in public schools or something like that, etc. There's a lot of examples that could be brought up here. So, that would fall under the category of the civil establishment of religion, making sure freedom of religion, maybe it's freedom to practice different denominations, but not all denominations or all other religions. And so, yeah, that would be passing laws based on Christian beliefs, so to speak. That would not be correct in my view. But in my view, where I think that what the Bible teaches is that civil government is there for the enforcement of civil justice. And so, just retribution means that because it's about coercion, that the only just use of coercion is in response to another coercion that has been initiated. So it's defensive or it's responsive. It's aimed at restitution and justice to those who have had their rights violated. Well, I think those are Christian principles. And so you could say that I'm enforcing Christian principles that way with government, but that's why, when I had that debate with Andrew, it was kind of okay, fine. You could call that Christian nationalism, but that's just kind of redefining terms or making terms meaningless because they mean so many different things. And you have to get then into the specifics to see what I'm actually advocating for. Because it's to you, Christian nationalism has all this baggage. And to me, when I'm saying, yeah, the government should do things according to Christian norms, we're defining those Christian norms entirely differently. And so that's very important because I reject establishmentarianism. All right, I'm going to keep playing here.
So that is the ideal Presbyterian political theology. We're not Anabaptists. A lot of the Anabaptists during the Reformation wanted to not be involved with secular politics at all because they're like, oh, God's kingdom is not of this world. But Presbyterians were like, yeah, it's not of this world, but it colonizes this world. It has an influence on this world, and God is king over everything. But they still believe in a two kingdoms theology, that God reigns over the church and the secular world in different ways. So both of them should submit to Christ, but they're not necessarily the same institution. That's what we meant by separation of church and state. So I already made a video about that. But unfortunately, since neither Trump nor Kamala Harris had a Presbyterian theocracy as one of their political platforms, sadly, we have to wonder how we're supposed to be involved in a country where nobody really is trying to install what we want. How politically involved should Christians be in a country that's increasingly secular? Now, a lot of these big evangelical pastors will say, oh, Christians shouldn't be involved in politics at all. A lot of Tim Keller's followers say this. Not Tim Keller himself. Tim Keller himself was a lot more conservative than a lot of his followers. But a lot of the Kellerites or the John Piper-esque people will say, separation of church and state, it's not the church's job to win the culture war. It's just the church's job to save individual souls and then let the Holy Spirit convert the hearts of individual people. Now, obviously, that is the church's job. But is that the church's only job? I don't think so. I think the church should be politically involved. I don't think it contradicts separation of church and state for the church to advocate for the state to uphold good morals. And how do we know what good morals are? I mean, there is natural law. You can just use reason in some sense, but it's not wrong for the government to make laws based on the Bible. Now, this isn't theonomy. I'm not a theonomist because theonomy is a very specific position that's actually very, very new, which says that the Old Testament law should be the basis for civil government in some sense. And, none of the reformers believed that. John Calvin explicitly rejected that view. But that doesn't mean the Bible can't be used for moral principles in terms of the government. So I think Christians should be politically involved. I think it's very important. Why? If we really believe that Christ is king over everything, that includes not just our personal lives, that includes the entire world. And if we believe that Christ is king and that Christ is a good king, then it is actually loving to our neighbors to advocate for Christian principles in the public sphere, in government. I feel like a lot of Christians are ashamed of their own faith. I feel like a lot of Christians feel like, oh, if I sort of forced Christian values on the outside world, that wouldn't be very loving of me. Why not? Don't you think Christian values are loving? Isn't it loving to not want to kill a bunch of babies through abortion? Isn't it loving to advocate for, law and order, which the Bible demands, and not let criminals roam the streets freely? Isn't that loving? So if you're not ashamed of your faith, if you really believe that biblical principles are not just what we personally, individually decide to follow, if you really think that they're objectively good, if you really think that they're from an objectively good God, why shouldn't we advocate for biblical principles in the public square? So what I think we need to do is we need to normalize Christians advocating for Christian values in the public sphere. And that is the Presbyterian view of things. Presbyterians, the Scottish Presbyterian Covenanters who wrote the Westminster Confession, they all believed this. They all believed that the state needs to submit to Christ. Now, some of the more extreme Presbyterian Covenanters, the RP...
All right, so for sake of time, I'm going to stop there. There's more that he says that I wanted to get to, but I'm just not going to get to it. What I'm going to do is read it because I think he touched on things that were important. So I want to find some area of agreement, right? I agree with sort of the spirit of what he said, which is where, I'm not an Anabaptist, and I love my Anabaptist brothers and sisters. We just disagree on some certain theological points, including certain political implications, and sometimes certain Anabaptist, certain even just regular Baptist or non-denominational Christian tendencies are to be sort of retreatist from the world and to think that we should not be trying to transform culture or reclaim culture or have a positive influence. The way he put that, the kingdom of God is not of this world, but it is for this world. It colonizes this world. I do tend to, as a Kuyperian, sympathize with that. And I think it is loving to try to see more Christian values enforced in society. Again, it does depend on how we define those things, though, right? So insofar as Redeemed Zoomer is an advocate for a more, less of a radical isolationist two kingdoms and more for a Kuyperian comprehensive kingdom, two kingdoms view, so to speak, we would be in agreement in terms of the spirit of that. And I think that Christians should also be engaged in politics. We shouldn't think that because God's kingdom is not of this world that all we do is go to church on Sundays and we just focus on religious matters, but that politics, current events, things going on in the world, that we should be disengaged from that. I think quite the opposite. We should be very engaged in it in a way. And I think part of the gospel message includes certain like there's political consequences to the gospel, is the way I would put it, right? So there's agreement there in sort of the certain presuppositions that we have, but so one of the things he says later, which he had kind of already said in what I had said, but said it differently. He says, so if you're Christian, no matter what you are, you should be involved politically, but especially if you're Presbyterian, there's no excuse not to be. If you're Presbyterian, if you subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, you should have the same beliefs as the people who wrote the Westminster Confession of Faith. Again, but like which one? Because if you're an American Presbyterian, then you'd have to agree with the rewrites, which means we're against establishmentarianism. So we would reject enforcing religious principles by means of the civil government. And the only thing that we're enforcing is that which the Bible was clear about enforcement, which is civil justice, right? Which is a Christian value, but it's not like we're enforcing Christianity on people. So I would love to have some clarity from Zoomer on that. Another thing he says is you should be advocating for your country. We didn't get to this part in the clip, but what he says later on is, I have the quote here, you should be advocating for your country. Whatever your country is, you should be advocating for that country to submit to Christ because Christ is king. And Christ is king over all the nations. So Americans, you should advocate for America to officially submit to Christ, not just individuals in America. Obviously need to do that, but America collectively should submit to Christ. America collectively should be in covenant with Christ, just like Scotland was in the 1600s. So this is wrong because God only establishes covenant with people and groups of people. Now, the covenant that is in force today is the new covenant. And so when you had like the Mosaic covenant, right, which was an eschatological intrusion, was a special covenant, had a suspension of sort of the common grace order. I've done previous episodes with that with Greg Baus from Reformed Libertarians, and they've, of course, covered that as well in their podcast. I'll have links to all that in the show notes. This does not involve, however, in the new covenant. With the new covenant, what is normative is not covenants made with a collective or an institution other than the church, other than the body of Christ. So now, the church influences society, right? That's not in question. But that doesn't mean that America as like a nation or some political body can or should be in covenant with Christ. We don't live under such a covenantal arrangement. Christians, whether individually or in community outside the church, can be politically involved, again, and I would say should be. But that does not mean enforcing religion in terms of that which is to be submitted to voluntarily by those who have been born again in Christ, who have been chosen by Christ through election, through the gift of faith. So the real issue here is like, what does God actually require in the new covenant era to be coercively enforced through civil governance, which is why, again, I needed to have Zoomer define what he means by the state, and why I think it's important to separate the state from governance, because the state, for being charitable here, the state is a form of monopoly government, but it distorts biblical governance, is my claim. And I'd like him to engage with those arguments. But at the end of the day, submitting to Christ means not submitting to him because of religion being coercively enforced upon us. In fact, submitting to Christ is the opposite, right? It means not coercively enforcing religion. So there's a really good article I'm going to plug here at the end, which will also be in the show notes, by Reformed Libertarians, which gets into the arguments against the civil establishment of religion and establishmentarianism. And it's going to be a really good resource to help think about these things a little bit more deeply as well. And yeah, I wish I had more time, but I think that'll be sufficient for now. I'll probably have another go at our brother in Christ, Redeemed Zoomer, at some point in the future. I hope to have a dialogue with him at some point as well. That invitation is out there and always open. And if you're watching this Zoomer, reach out to me, Jacob at libertarianchristians.com, or at Biblical Anarchy on X. That's also a reminder for you guys. You can go follow me on X. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed the contents of what we talked about here today. And that's all I have for you. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.